God, or the first cause, is unknowable, but being everywhere, he is necessarily within us. It is therefore within ourselves that we shall succeed in discovering what it behooves us to know of him. These are the two supporting piers of the arch sustaining the primitive religion and all those religions which spring there from, or at least, the actual though secret doctrine of all those religions. That is, of all the religions known to us, apart from the fetishism of utterly barbarous peoples. It found these points of support in the beginning, or rather in what we call the beginning, which must have had behind it a past of thousands, perhaps millions, of years. We have found no others. We never shall find others, failing an impossible revelation, impossible in fact if not in principle. For nothing that is not human or divinely human can reach us. We have returned to the point whence our forefathers set out, and the day on which humanity discovers another such point will be the most extraordinary day that will have shone upon our planet since its birth. The incarnations of God, in primitive religious thought, are merely periodical and sporadic externalizations, dazzling manifestations, synthetic and exceptional, of the God who is in every human being. This incarnation is universal and latent in each of us. But while the incarnation is regarded as a privilege for the man in whom it occurs, it is considered a sacrifice on the part of the God. Vishnu willingly sacrifices himself when he descends to earth in the person of Krishna or Buddha, as he likewise sacrificed himself by descending to earth in the rest of mankind. Whence comes this idea of sacrifice? It is a mysterious idea, dating assuredly from traditions of great antiquity. In any case, it does not appear to be purely rational, like the two previous conceptions. Nowhere is it explained why it is necessary that an emanation of God should descend into man, who is already a divine emanation. Here is a gap which is not bridged by the myth of the fall, a myth which is likewise unexplained, unless the idea in question is based merely upon the declaration that every man who surpasses his fellows, whose sight is keener than theirs, and who teaches them what they cannot yet understand, is necessarily misunderstood, persecuted, a hapless sacrifice. This idea, whether it can or cannot be explained, is known the less of great importance, for it seems to have steered primitive morality into one of its principal highways. Indeed, the conception of the unknowable, while it set free those courageous thinkers who had ventured upon its naked peaks, was powerless to afford more than a negative doctrine. To be sure, it dispersed the little anthropomorphic and almost always maleficent gods, but in their place it left only a vast and silent void. On the other hand, pantheism, being as comprehensive as agnosticism, taught that as God was everywhere and all things were God, all things ought to be loved and respected. But it followed that evil, or at least that which man is forced to call evil, was divine, just as goodness is divine, so that it must be loved and respected equally with goodness. The idea was too stark, too illimitable, overarching the two poles of the universe into colossal of fashion. Man did not dare to involve himself, did not dare to select a pathway. Lastly, the search for the God hidden in each of us, which is one of the corollaries of pantheism, if it be left without guidance, could only have perilous consequences. There are within us all kinds of gods, that is, all sorts of instincts, thoughts, or passions, which may be taken for gods. Some are good and some evil, and the evil gods are often more numerous, and in any case more readily discoverable than the good. The true God, the supremest deity and the most immaterial, reveals himself only to a few. This God being thus revealed, who is, after all, no more than the best thoughts of the best of us, he had to call upon himself the attention of other men, to make himself known to them, to impose himself upon them. And it is perhaps for this reason that this singular myth, which fundamentally is probably no more than the recognition of a natural and human phenomenon, has little by little obtruded itself, struck root, and developed. It is indeed probable enough, like everything else connected with the evolution of mankind, that it did not suddenly spring from a single mind, but dimly took shape, slowly assuming a definite form in the course of unnumbered centuries of tentative experiments. Without lingering longer over this enigma, we shall confine ourselves to considering its influence on primitive morality, by directing the latter from the very outset toward other pinnacles than those to which the understanding pointed the way. In its absence, the primitive morality which believed itself to be listening to a hidden God, but which in truth was only giving ear to human reason, would have been no more than a morality of the brain that might have been deflected toward a barren contemplation or a cold, rigid, austere, and implacable rationalism. For the reason alone, even when it reaches the loftiest heights and is taken for the voice of God, is not enough to guide mankind toward the summits of abnegation, goodness, and love. The example of an initial sacrifice curbed its severity, launching it in another direction and toward a goal of which it might perhaps in the end have caught a glimpse, but which it would not have reached until very much later, after many grievous mistakes. Is it upon this myth of incarnation that the dogma has grafted itself? Although properly speaking there are no dogmas in the Oriental religions, the dogma of reincarnation in which are found all the sanctions and all the rewards of the primitive religion. The essential principle of man, the basis of his ego, being divine and immortal, after the disappearance of the body which has for the time being divorced it from its spiritual origin, should logically return to that origin. But, on the other hand, the invisible God, having through the medium of the great incarnations introduced into morality the conception of good and evil, it did not seem admissible that the soul, which had not listened to its own voice or to that of the divine teachers, and which had become more or less soiled by its earthly life, should be able, at once and without previous purification, to return to the immaculate ocean of the eternal spirit. From incarnation to reincarnation there was only a step, which, without doubt, was taken all but unconsciously. From reincarnation to successive reincarnations and purifications, the transition was even simpler. And from these proceeds the whole of the Hindu moral philosophy, with its karma, which after all is only the judicial record of the soul, a record which is always up to date, becoming worse or better in the course of its palingenesis, until the attainment of nirvana, which is not, as it is too often described, an annihilation or a dispersal in the bosom of the deity, nor yet, on the other hand, a reunion with God, coinciding with the perfecting of the human spirit freed of matter, an absolute acquiescence in the law, an unalterable tranquility in the contemplation of that which exists, a disinterested hope in that which ought to be, and repose in the absolute, that is, in the world of causes in which all the illusions of the senses disappear, but a more mysterious state which is neither perfect happiness nor annihilation, but, properly speaking and once again, the unknowable. That perfection exists after death, says a text contemporary with the Buddha, revealing the meaning of nirvana, which had then become esoteric. That perfection both exists and does not exist after death. That likewise is not true. As Oldenburg says very truly, citing this passage among several others in which the same admission is made, this is not to deny nirvana or perfection, or to conclude that it does not exist at all. Here the spirit has reached the brink of an unfathomable mystery, useless to seek to disclose it. If one were finally to renounce a future eternity, one would speak in another fashion. It is the heart that takes refuge behind the veil of the mystery. From the mind that hesitates to admit eternal life as conceivable, it seeks to wrest the hope of a life that passes all understanding. All this amounts to a repetition of the old fundamental admissions that in respect of essentials we know nothing and can know nothing, while it is also a fresh proof of the magnificent sincerity and the lofty and sovereign wisdom of the primitive religion. Will all living beings end by attaining nirvana? What is to happen in that case, and why is it, since all things exist from all eternity, that all have not already reached it? To these questions and others of a like nature the Vedas vouchsafed only a disdainful silence. But some of the Buddhist texts, and among them the following, discreetly reply to those who would know too much. This the Sublime One has not revealed, because it does not minister to salvation, because it is no help to the devout life, because it does not conduce to detachment from earthly things, to the annihilation of desire, to cessation, to repose, to knowledge, to illumination, to nirvana. For this reason the Sublime has revealed nothing relating to it. Whatever the value of these hypotheses, it is indubitable that the moral system which we find proceeding from this boundless agnosticism and pantheism is the noblest, the purest, the most disinterested, the most sensitive, the most thoroughly investigated, the most fastidious, the clearest, the completest that we have as yet known and doubtless could ever hope to know. This morality, as well as the enigma of incarnation and sacrifice of which we have just been speaking, and many other points which we have only touched upon, ought to be subjected to a special examination which does not enter into our design. It will suffice to recall the fact that it is based on the principle of successive reincarnations and of karma. The world, properly speaking, was not created. There is no word in Sanskrit that corresponds with the idea of creation, just as there is none that corresponds with the conception of nothingness. The universe is a momentary and doubtless illusory materialization of the unknown and spiritual cause. Divided from the spirit, which is its proper essence, actual and eternal, matter tends to return to it through all the phases of evolution. Starting from beneath the mineral stage, passing through plant and animal, ending in man, and outstripping him, it is transformed and spiritualized until it is sufficiently pure to return to its point of origin. This purification often demands a long series of reincarnations, but it is possible to reduce their number, and even to set a term to them, by an intensive spiritualization, heroic and absolute, which at death, and sometimes even during life, leads the soul back to the bosom of Brahma. This explanation of the inexplicable, despite the objections which suggest themselves, notably in respect of the origin and necessity of matter, or of evil, which remain obscure, is as good as any other, and has the advantage of being the earliest in date, apart from the fact that it is the most comprehensive, embracing all that can be imagined, setting out from the great spiritual principle to which, in the absence of any other of an acceptable nature, we are more and more imperiously compelled to return. In any case, as it has proved, it has favored more than any other the birth and development of a morality to which man had never attained, and which, so far, he has never surpassed. To give a sufficient idea of this morality would require more space than is at my disposal, and destroy the scheme of this inquiry. The wonderful thing about this morality, when we consider it near its source, where it still retains its purity, is that it is wholly internal, wholly spiritual. It finds its sanctions and its rewards only in our own hearts. There is no judge awaiting the soul on its release from the body. No paradise and no hell, for hell was a later development. The soul itself, the soul alone, is its judge, its heaven, or its hell. It encounters nothing, no one. It has no need to judge itself, for it sees itself as it is, as its thoughts and actions have made it, at the close of this life and of previous lives. It sees itself, in short, in its entirety, in the infallible mirror which death holds up to it, and realizes that it is its own happiness, its own misery. Happiness and suffering are self-created. It is alone in the infinite. There is no God above it to smile upon it or to fill it with terror. The God whom it has disappointed, displeased, or satisfied is itself. Its condemnation or its absolution depend upon that which it has become. It cannot escape from itself to go elsewhere where it might be more fortunate. It cannot breathe save in the atmosphere which it has created for itself. It is its own atmosphere, its own world, its own environment, and it must uplift and purify itself in order that this world and this environment may be purifying and uplifted, expanding with it and around it. The soul, says Manu, is its own witness. The soul is its own refuge. Never despise your soul, the sovereign witness of mankind. The wicked say, no one sees us, but the gods are watching them, as is the spirit enthroned within them. O man, when thou sayest to thyself, I am alone with myself, there dwells forever in thy heart this supreme spirit, the attentive and silent observer of all good and all evil. This spirit enthroned in thy heart is a strict judge, an inflexible avenger. He is Yama, the judge of the dead, between birth and death, which is but a new birth. The laws of Manu distinguish 5 stages: conception, childhood, the novitiate, or period of studying the sciences, divine and human, fatherhood, and, last of all, the stage of the anchorite preparing for death. Each of these periods has its duties, which must be accomplished before a man may look forward to withdrawal into the forest. While awaiting this hour, desired above all, resignation, says Marnor, the act of returning good for evil, temperance, honesty, purity, chastity, repression of the senses, knowledge of the sacred books, worship of truth, and abstention from anger. Such are the 10 virtues of which duty consists. The aim of our life on this earth is to set a limit to our reincarnations, for reincarnation is a punishment which the soul is compelled to inflict upon itself for so long as it does not feel that it is pure enough to return to God. To attain the last phase, says Manor, never again to be reborn upon this earth, that is the ideal. To be assured of eternal happiness, assured that the earth shall no longer behold the soul returning to cloak itself once again in its gross substance. This purification, this progressive dematerialization, this renunciation of all egoism, begins when life begins and is continued through all the phases of existence. But one must first of all accomplish all the duties of this active existence. For all of you must know, say the sacred books, that none of you shall achieve absorption into the bosom of Brahma by prayer alone. And the mysterious monosyllable will not efface your latest defilement, except you reach the threshold of the future life laden with good works. And the most meritorious of these works will be those which are based upon the motives of charity and love for one's neighbor. One single good action, says Manu further, you is worth more than 1,000 good thoughts, and those who fulfill their obligations are superior to those who perceive them. Let the sage constantly observe the moral obligations yamas more attentively than the religious duties niyamas, for he who neglects the moral duties is losing ground even if he observes his religious obligations. There are in the life of man two plainly distinguished periods: the active or social phase during which he establishes his family, assures the fate of his posterity, and tills the soil with his own hands, fulfilling the humble duties of everyday life toward his relatives and those about him. For these yet ungodly days abound in the most angelic precepts of resignation, of respect for life, of patience and love. The ills which we inflict upon our neighbor, says Krishna, pursue us as our shadows follow our bodies. Just as the earth upholds those that trample it underfoot and rend its bosom with the plough, so we should return good for evil. Let all men remember that self-respect and love for one's neighbor stand above all things. He who fulfills all his obligations to please God only and without thinking of future reward is sure of immortal happiness. If a pious action proceeds from the hope of reward in this world or the next, that ascetian is described as interested. But that which has no other motive than the knowledge and love of God is said to be disinterested. Let us reflect for a moment upon this saying, many thousands of years old. One of those sayings which we can repeat today without the change of a syllable. For here God, as in all the Vedic literature, is the best and eternal part of ourselves and of the universe. The man whose religious actions are all interested attains the rank of the saints and the angels devas. But he whose pious actions are all disinterested divests himself forever of the five elements, to acquire immortality in the great soul. Of all things that purify man, purity in the acquisition of wealth is the best. He who retains his purity while becoming rich is truly pure, not he who purifies himself with earth and water. Learned men purify themselves by the forgiveness of trespasses, alms, and prayer. The understanding is purifying by knowledge. The hand of a craftsman is always pure while he is working. Although the conduct of her husband be blameworthy, although he may abandon himself to other loves and may be without good qualities, a virtuous woman must always revere him as a god. He who has defiled the water by some impurity must live upon alms only for a full month, in order not to cause the death of any living creature. Let the sannyasin, that is, the mendicant ascetic, by night as well as by day, even at the risk of injury, walk with his gaze upon the ground. For having on one occasion only, and without any ill intention, cut down trees bearing fruit, or bushes, or tree creepers, or climbing plants, or crawling plants in flower, one must repeat 100 prayers from the Rig Veda. If a man idly uproots cultivated plants or plants which have sprung up spontaneously in the forest, he must follow a cow for a whole day and take no food but milk. By a confession made in public, by repentance, by piety, by the recitation of sacred prayers, a sinner may be acquitted of his offense, as well as by giving alms, when he finds it impossible to perform the other penance. In proportion as his soul regrets a bad action, so far his body is relieved of the burden of this perverse action. Success in all worldly affairs depends upon the laws of destiny, controlled by the actions of mortals in their previous lives, and the conduct of the individual. The decrees of destiny are a mystery. We must accordingly have recourse to means which depend upon man. Justice is the sole friend who accompanies man after death, since all affection is subject to the destruction suffered by the body. If he who strikes you drops the staff which he has used, pick it up and return it to him without complaint. You will not abandon animals in their old age, remembering what services they have rendered you. He who despises a woman despises his mother. The tears of women draw down the fire of heaven upon those that make them flow. The upright man may fall beneath the blows of the wicked, as does the sandal tree, which, when it is felled, perfumes the axe that lays it low. to carry the 3 staves of the ascetic, to keep silence, to wear the hair in a plait, to shave the head, to clothe oneself in garments of bark or skins, to say prayers and perform ablutions, to celebrate the Agnihotra, to dwell in the forest, to allow the body to become emaciated. All this is useless if the heart is not pure. He who, whatever pains he may spend on himself, practices tranquility of mind, who is calm, resigned, restrained, and chaste, and has ceased to find fault with others, that man is truly a Brahman, a Shraman, an ascetic, a bhikshu, a mendicant friar. O Bharata, of what avail is the forest to him who has mastered himself, and of what avail is it to him who has not mastered himself? Wherever there lives a man who has mastered himself, there is the forest, there is the hermitage. If the wise man stay at home, whatever care he may take of himself, if all the days of his life he is always pure and full of love, he is delivered from all evil. It is not the hermitage that makes the virtuous man. Virtue comes only with practice. Therefore let no man do unto others that which would cause pain to himself. The world is sustained by every action whose sole object is sacrifice. That is, the voluntary gift of self. It is in making this voluntary gift that man should perform the action, without respect of usage. The sole object of action should be to serve others. He who sees inaction in action and action in inaction is wise among men. He is attuned to the true principles, whatever action he may perform. Such a man, who has renounced all interest in the result of his action, and is always content, depending upon no one, although he may perform actions, is as one who does not perform them. All his thoughts, stamped with wisdom, and all his actions, consisting of sacrifice, are as though faded into air. There, taken at random, from an enormous treasury which is still partly unknown, are a few words of counsel, thousands of years old, which, long before the advent of Christianity, guided men of goodwill to the border of the forest. Then, as Manu says, when the head of the family sees his skin grow wrinkled and his hair turn white, when he beholds the son of his son, when he has no further obligations to fulfill, when no one has further need of his assistance, then, whether he be the richest merchant of the city or the poorest peasant of the village, he may at last devote himself to things eternal, leaving his wife, his children, his kinsfolk, his friends, and, taking a gazelle skin or a cloak of bark, may withdraw into solitude, burying himself in the vast tropical forest, forgetting his body and the vain ideas born of it, and giving ear to the voice of the God hidden in the depths of his being, the voice of the unseen traveler, in the words of the Brahman of the 100 paths, the voice of him who, understanding, is not understood, of the thinker of whom known thinks, of him who knows but is not known, of the Atman, the inner guide, the imperishable, apart from whom there is only suffering. He may meditate on the infinity of space, the infinity of reason, and the non-existence of nothing, may seize the moment of illumination which brings with it the deliverance which no one can teach, which each must find for himself, which is ineffable, and may purify his soul in order to spare it, if that be possible, yet another return to earth. Having reached this stage, let him not wish for death. Let him not wish for life. Like a harvester who, at the fall of night, waits quietly for his wages at his master's door, let him wait until the moment has arrived. Let him meditate, with the most exclusive application of the intellect, upon the subtle and indivisible nature of the Supreme Mind, and on its existence in the bodies of the highest and lowest of created things, meditating with joy upon the Supreme Being, having need of nothing, inaccessible to any desire of the senses, without other society than his own soul and the thought of God. Let him live in the constant expectation of eternal bliss. For the chiefest of all his obligations is to acquire knowledge of the Supreme Mind. And this is the first of all the sciences, for this alone confers immortality upon man. Thus the man who discovers the Supreme Mind in his own mind, and present in all living creatures, will show himself the same to all, and will thus assure himself of the happiest fate, that of being finally absorbed into the bosom of Brahma. Having thus abandoned all pious practices and acts of austere devotion, applying his intellect solely to the contemplation of the great first cause, exempt from all evil desires, his soul is already on the threshold of Swarga, while his mortal envelope is still flickering like the last glimmer of a dying lamp. Almost all the foregoing, let us remember, is long previous to Buddhism, dating from the origins of Brahmanism, and is directly related to the Vedas. Let us agree that this system of ethics, of which I have been unable to give more than the slightest survey, while the first ever known to man, is also the loftiest which he has ever practiced. It proceeds from a principle which we cannot contest even today, with all that we believe ourselves to have learned, namely, that man, with all that surrounds him, is but a sort of emanation, an ephemeral materialization of the unknown spiritual cause to which it must needs return, and it merely deduces, with incomparable beauty, nobility, and logic, the consequences of this principle. There is no extraterrestrial revelation, no Sinai, no thunder in the heavens, no God especially sent down upon our planet. There was no need for him to descend hither, for he was here already, in the hearts of all men, since all men are but a part of him and cannot be otherwise. They question this God, who seems to dwell in their hearts, their minds. In a word, in that immaterial principle which gives life to their bodies. He does not tell them. It is true, or perhaps he does tell them, but they cannot understand him. Why? For the time being, he appears to have divorced them from himself. And we have here a postulate, the origin of evil and the necessity of suffering as inaccessible as the mystery of the first cause. With this difference, that the mystery of the first cause was inevitable, whereas the necessity of evil and suffering is incomprehensible. But once the postulate is granted, all the rest clears up and enfolds itself like a syllogism. Matter is that which divides us from God. The Spirit is that which unites us to Him. The Spirit therefore must prevail over matter. But the Spirit is not merely the understanding. It is also the heart. It is emotion. It is all that is not material, so that in all its forms it must needs purify itself, reaching forth and uplifting itself, to triumph over matter. There never was and never could be, I believe, a more impressive spiritualization than this, nor more logical, more unassailable, more realistic, in the sense that it is founded only on realities, and never one more divinely human. Certain it is that after so many centuries, after so many acquisitions, so many experiences, we find ourselves back at the same point, starting, like our predecessors, from the unknowable. We can come to no other conclusion, and we could not express it better. Nothing could excel the stupendous effort of their speech, unless it were a silent resignation, preferable in theory, but in practice leading only to an inert and despairing ignorance.